Well, let's get back to what happened Saturday in Lincoln, which I don't think surprised too many people. It didn't surprise me, but it was impressive. It was on the impressive side of what I expected, that's for sure. I expected a more competitive game, and Nebraska hit up Oklahoma's defense with a finely tuned drive right out of the gate for a touchdown, and they got a 3-and-out. And Nebraska won that first 2 or 3 drives. And then after that, once it turned in a big way. 35 points in the first half. The running game was devastating. And Nebraska's a mess, obviously, when you fire your coach this early in the season. We know what the deal is with Nebraska. So their issues aside, because that can explain away some of the dominance. But still, that was an impressive win, start to finish.
Yeah, absolutely, Mark. I think, to your point, all things considered, I think it was a very impressive win. And as we've seen, the first legitimate opponent in the non-conference for Oklahoma. All due respect to UTEP and Kent State, but I think it was the first, test that you would see out of this Oklahoma team. Obviously, Oklahoma's going to face tougher tests through the conference season than what Nebraska provided on Saturday, but still in a somewhat hostile environment, at least early on in that game. And then you didn't, I think what was good that happened to them early on is, they struggled a little bit on their first offensive possession, and Nebraska went down the field very, very quickly. And for those that were there, the crowd was really much into the game. A lot of positivity flowing through that Nebraska sideline. And then, as you mentioned, Oklahoma pretty much dominated the game the rest of the way. There was a couple of drives where Nebraska got some things going, but Oklahoma was able to thwart those drives and force a punt. And then, as you mentioned, Oklahoma completely dominated that game defensively until mid third, early fourth, when the game was in doubt at that point. And so I think there's a few things that you really have to take into consideration that you really love if you're an Oklahoma fan. I think the thing that you have to take into consideration is obviously not necessarily understanding the mindset of these Nebraska kids coming into a game, having so much distraction this week. And, I didn't really have a ton. We talked about this when we were on last week, not a ton of respect for how bad that Nebraska defense had been up to this point, particularly against Georgia Southern. So I felt Oklahoma, maybe not necessarily to the tune of how many points they scored, but I did feel that Oklahoma had the upper hand when the offense come against Nebraska's defense. However, I still did have a ton of respect for that Nebraska offense. Casey Thompson, Trey Palmer, Anthony Grant as well. And Oklahoma, outside of that first couple of drives, they beat Casey Thompson to death with just the different looks and the different areas that Venables comes with pressure. And so what I thought was going to happen, I think, happened to a certain degree in terms of Oklahoma playing very vanilla on offense and defense those first couple of games, and then showing a little bit of a taste of what you get from a Venables defense, and having a lot of pressure, having it come from different spots, different looks, different alignments, and things like that. So the one thing that Oklahoma has struggled over the last few years, particularly on the defensive side of the ball, is making adjustments really quickly. Sometimes it's taking a half, sometimes it's even taking a full game before some of those adjustments happen. And you see that adjustment made within a drive or two. And then, they completely shut Nebraska down. I think Casey Thompson had around 80 or 90 yards passing in the first couple of drives, and probably equaled that for the rest of the game. After that, Oklahoma was able to really shut down Anthony Grant from a running game perspective. I think he had 30 or 40 yards total. I mean, Trey Palmer he scored that touchdown on that first possession, and he was really kind of the go-to guy from a receiver perspective. But then, so the folks that have been clamoring for a much better, much physical much more physical, better overall defense. I mean, what's happening is that I think a lot of people thought. Now, I think for me, I think they've come together a little bit quicker than I thought that they might. I thought there would be some struggles early on as they kind of get acclimated, and this defense is going to get better and better. So I think you've got to be thrilled if you're an Oklahoma fan where this team is at defensively after 3 games. On the offensive side of the ball, again, there's some things where areas where Oklahoma struggled, and again, the defensive line that Nebraska put out there and the defensive line that Oklahoma is going to face this week against Kansas State is much different. Kansas State's a much, even with the loss this past weekend, they're a much better team from a defensive perspective than Oklahoma has played to at this point. But you got to like what you saw out of the offensive line. Wanye Morris came in and played really, really well. Didn't start the first series, but came in. For Tyler Guyton and that physicality up front. And I think the tackles had played well for the most part. You know, Tyler Guyton's young, and so you expected a little bit of you expected a solid performance from the tackles. But I think what's been more concerning is the interior of the offensive line. And there's a couple of situations where Oklahoma played really, really well. And I think overall, when you run for over 300 yards in a football game, your offensive line has to have a ton of credit. But I also think when you look at how Eric Gray I heard some other people talking. Maybe he heard what a lot of us were talking about in terms of Marcus Major, maybe kind of being making a move to be that first that number one tailback, and he had his best game in a Sooner uniform, over 10 yards a carry, couple of touchdown runs, ran hard, made a couple of really good moves in the open field for those touchdown runs. And so Oklahoma probably could have scored in the 60s in this game if they would have kept going. I think the one thing, and of course you always, and maybe this is me from a coach's background, but just in general, you got to see some of the negatives that came with it. I think a couple of the negatives, which was very odd to see. Gabriel missed a lot of throws in this game. Oklahoma had receivers running wide open pretty much consistently throughout the game. A couple of slants, and all of them were high. So I don't know if it was a little bit, just his excitement. I don't know if nerves were the case, but he's been much more accurate to this point. And then there was a period there in the second and third quarter where he missed a lot of stuff high. So I think it'll be interesting to see what that development looks like. That not really from a timing perspective, because the plays that they hit on, they looked like they were more in sync, a team that's starting to get things rolling in the passing game, but just a few high throws that could have been big gainers. But I think you take that bad with all of the good that happened in this game, and Oklahoma's in in a good spot. But let's see as the competition, particularly on the defensive side of the ball, is a little bit tougher here over the next couple of weeks, and then which obviously leads up to Red River in about 3 weeks.
Yeah, Nebraska's been a train wreck on the defensive side of the ball. In particular, they fired their DC after this game, Eric Shenander. So they had just given up a record number of points and yardage in Lincoln against Georgia Southern, of all teams. And Northwestern, they made them look like a prolific offense, and they've just been run ragged by everybody. So Oklahoma did what they should do. So it shouldn't all be placed on that Nebraska is just so bad that Oklahoma could do nothing but score points. No, they were impressive on offense, especially on the ground. 312 yards of rushing. And again, 35 points, and they really took it easy on Nebraska in the second half after the 35 spot in the first half. But to your point, defensively, now that's where Nebraska is capable. I'm not going to sell them as one of the best offenses in the country, but they're good on offense. They've scored against everyone. They were scoring last year. Little different personnel, but still some of the same parts last year. And again, they didn't have issues moving the ball or scoring points in the first 3 weeks of the season. And after that first drive, they really didn't do anything meaningful after that.
Yeah, no, you're absolutely right, and I think, like I said, I think that and Urban Meyer talked about it in the pregame, that Brent Venables' defense is all about chaos and creating that chaos and that confusion up front, and they did a really good job. I think you've got a couple of kids that are playing at a higher level than they've ever played. In just 3 games in, Deshaun White is playing in that cheetah position, and he's playing, much better. Obviously, made a little bit of a mistake there with that targeting call that he had on Casey Thompson toward the end of the second quarter, but still playing really really well. Corners recovering well. I mean, I think they had one. That they only really had one. Big play that they gave up, which was that 32-yard touchdown pass to Trey Palmer there in the first quarter. But they're rallying to the ball. They're playing very, very physical across the defensive line of scrimmage. And so, again, and this is with other coaches, players, other coaches, recruits. So obviously they're good players, or they wouldn't have been recruited to Oklahoma. But he's been able to do this thus far. I made a joke. I made a tweet on Saturday that was a little bit tongue in cheek, but to a certain degree, like he's been able to fix in 3 games what it's taken some other defensive coordinators almost a decade to ruin. So I think, which is obviously a little bit of a joke, but a little bit of seriousness in terms of where they're able to where they've been able to get thus far. So, like I said, the some of these teams will get better. Now, I think Nebraska, coming into it, at least, I think Nebraska's a better offensive team than Kansas State is. At least right now, you've got obviously Deuce Vaughn, one of the best running backs in the country. But aside from that, Adrian Martinez, he looks average. I mean, just as like he's been. I don't know that he's turning the ball over, but for whatever reason, he's not getting the ball downfield. So, I mean, obviously, there's a little bit of a look ahead there. I think that bit Kansas State, but yeah, I mean, you go through these 3 games and you've given up, I would say 2 legitimate touchdowns. The last one I don't really, take a lot to consideration, but the one touchdown against UTEP and then the first quarter touchdown against Nebraska. But I think you're seeing Billy Bowman's another kid that keeps playing better and better. Reggie Grimes, on the defensive end perspective, is playing better and better. So I think you're going to see continuous improvement out of this team. At least that's what you would anticipate and what you would hope, because Venables is one of those coaches. If they're not getting, pressure, he's going to make with their front four. He's going to make sure he's bringing people, whether it be from the secondary, whether it be from the linebacker side. So, and I think one thing that you also saw from Oklahoma from a depth perspective is we've talked a little bit about him, whether he would see the field or. Jaron Canick came in, played that cheetah position for Deshaun White when he came out, forced a fumble, was all around the ball. Yeah, he missed a few tackles, but I think he's going to be a guy that can provide Oklahoma some depth if they need it. But I think it was funny. Venables talked about him after the game and basically said he has no idea what he's doing right now, but he's going to be a really, really good player for us before he leaves here. And so, getting those guys, putting those guys in positions to be successful, and I think you saw it on the. I don't know if it was there on the tape, but I remember seeing this going back that as soon as as soon as they gave up that touchdown, that opening touchdown, Venables had the entire defense circled around, and there was some probably very choice words and adjustments and kind of getting them to settle down, which they did, obviously after that possession. So you've got to be. I mean, I think just the defense have been missing it for this program for so long. I think people are even. I noticed this on my post game. People are still second guessing things. I think it's almost one of those things. It's too I don't want to say it's too early to say it's too good to be true, but I think it's one of the things I think people are even expected this, but I think it's that it's happening. They're playing better earlier than I think some people even thought was possible.